If you're familiar with this channel, you will know that we periodically celebrate Final Fantasy VIII, despite the fact, or perhaps because of the fact, it's a pretty weird game. It is a world of juxtaposition and contradiction, scenic affable academies that train child soldiers, sorceresses and knights coexisting in a futuristic setting, and even the timelines and deuteragony of Squall Leonhardt and Laguna Loire are a contradiction in terms, with one being an affable talkative soldier for the Galbadian military, and the other being an introverted stoic mercenary fighting against the Galbadian military. And as a high point of this weirdness, which uniquely impacts the structure, pacing and experience of Final Fantasy VIII, is the flying school of Balamb Garden, a profound narrative and design decision which sets the title apart within both the Final Fantasy anthology and broader JRPGs in general. Now, Balamb Garden is really a fascinating location in the game that serves several purposes throughout. In some ways, we could reflect that this location evolves almost like a character arc does over the course of the story, and it shifts and moves to suit new purposes and contexts as our adventure progresses. At the start of the game, Balamb Garden is the first location that we inhabit and explore. We wake up as Squall Leonhardt in the infirmary following his duel with Cypher, and it's here that the uniqueness first becomes apparent, because unlike other Final Fantasy games, which often throw us into the flux of action or an event, Balamb Garden immediately conveys a certain calm and serenity as a location, and it's something that I've covered in a recent episode discussing the coziness of Final Fantasy VIII. But more so than that, and looking at it as a narrative device and a location, it's also unique that we are waking up in our hero's home. Looking to other Final Fantasy heroes, we often find stories about displacement. Our introduction to Cloud Strife is on the flux of a train journeying through Midgar. Zidane Tribal, likewise, he's on an airship in transit to kidnap Princess Garnet. Tidus in Final Fantasy X, the introduction, we see him ejected from his homeland of Zanarkand and into the unknown realms of Spira. So many of these titles show our heroes working their way back towards their hometown in the late game, and as part of their character arcs and this point of self-realization. For example, famously, Cloud Strife confronting his eerie past, Zidane arriving back to Lindeblum at the hideout, and then later Terra, his homeworld, and Tidus, of course, trying to work his way back to Zanarkand throughout Final Fantasy X. And so in most of these stories, the homeland comes as a later point of the hero's character arc. Final Fantasy VIII, on the other hand, shows us beginning in the comfort of our home, or at least a comfortable surrogate to Squall's original home, which is of course the orphanage, which is a bit more in keeping with these aforementioned examples. But Balamb Garden is uniquely an environment that isn't destroyed or taken away from us, but bizarrely it is something that we can revisit, inhabit, and return to, and later of course ultimately bring with us throughout the story as it becomes a mobilized vehicle. To unpack this a little bit more, I think we can look at the unique protagonist of Squall and observe how so many elements in this game work in service of his character arc and maturing him as a personality. Naturally, most obviously, we have Rinoa and his immediate friendship group who work to coax him out of his perpetually internalizing personality. But a key result of that growing openness, and I think a macro result of that, beyond the relationship he develops with Rinoa, is, I think, this ascension to leadership. And a key role of Balamb Garden is showing the result of that and bringing his leadership qualities into fruition. Indeed, if we look to other Final Fantasy heroes, they are all, to some degree or another, established professionals or specialists in what they do. They have defined roles, such as Cloud Strife being a mercenary, Zidane being a thief, Tidus being a blitzball star. But for his part, Squall is a student. He is still discovering and seeking purpose and definition about who he is, what his purpose is. So in this regard, Balamb Garden is representative of his journeying of self-discovery and ultimately, as I say, his ascension to leadership. And I think this is why a particularly memorable moment in the game is Sid Kramer handing the reins over, or rather abruptly forcing the reins over to Squall. And the subsequent scenarios that follow this are, for example, Fisherman's Horizon, the Battle of the Gardens, that really emphasise and show the maturity and pragmatism with which Squall is capable of So Balamb Garden persisting as a visitable location and core location for the story is essential to realising this growth and macro character arc of Squall, I think. And in a way, it's adjacent to many of these medieval knight's tales or Greek myths, where the adventurer returns home to become king of their kingdom. More broadly, I think thematically, where other heroes return to their hometowns to confront and move on from their past, I think Cloud Strife's story is a great example of that. Squall's adventure is more about embracing the past, and more particularly embracing the present too. And so Balamb Garden and all of the people in it who Squall had previously just pushed away or outright ignored, I think him opening up and leading those people, and again the Battle of the Gardens where we're giving instructions to the broader garden faculty, I think is a great example of that. It's almost an extension of him having opened up to Rinoa in a lot of ways. Moving on, Balamb Garden's role as a mode of transport is a fascinating aspect of Final Fantasy VIII. Reflecting on this, and as many comments on the channel have pointed out, it is a completely insane aspect of the game when looked at on paper, and even within the arena of fantasy schools, whether that's Hogwarts or Unseen University or whatever, an academy that flies around the world is pretty wild. Personally, I didn't really question this at the time, and I don't really question it on subsequent playthroughs, because I do feel it is a rewarding, if Deus Ex Machina moment of the game when we are trying to escape the Galbadian missile strike. I think in the flux of that scenario, the flux of that moment, it just felt like a rewarding, if bizarre, thing to happen. And Final Fantasy VIII as a succession of escalating, causal, unplanned scenarios and moments following moments in this increasing escalation, it just seemed like another fascinating segue of the plot that led on to the next scenario of Fisherman's Horizon. And I know some dissenters might think that this is ridiculous, some people were quite on board with it. I always quite enjoyed the fact we bring Garden with us. And I suppose, digression aside, the novelty of bringing this serene and comforting home with us on our adventure, rather than leaving it behind and having to periodically return to it, it does add to this warm coziness of the game that I've discussed in a previous episode. I also think it squares a particular circle of having an intermediary form of transport that would open up the world a little bit more. For example, where other Final Fantasy games have the tiny Bronco or a Chocobo or whatever, I always wondered how else they could navigate this in Final Fantasy VIII without relying on the train service, for example. So we could have had an intermediary transport like those watercraft that take us to Dole or something like that. But really, I think the presence of Garden, the set pieces, both emotive and functional that it opens up, such as the Battle of the Gardens, were really well done, and transiting the world in Garden is one of the wonderfully unique, if abstract, aspects of FF8. Now, I suppose coming on to a final point now that I have touched on in a dedicated episode, and I will link to these episodes that I've mentioned in passing below, we have the politics and internal strife that undulates beneath the surface of Balamb Garden. Now, many cite the presence and existence of Master Norg in the basement of Balamb Garden as perhaps even more ridiculous than Garden flying around itself. Some actually think it's a ruinous moment of the story for them. Yet for me, and I think for others who kind of took it in their stride and just were quite on board with it, for me it added another dimension to the institution of Garden. I also think it sought to reconcile the affable slice of school life vibes of the place with this other, inherently more mercenary academy, child soldier dimension. And what we have here, and what comes to a head in Disc 2, is the ideals of Headmaster Cid, who we learn is a leader in name only, and the ideals of Master Norg, who is this money-driven benefactor who invested in the academy and wants a financial return. Now, for Cid's part, we learn that he wants Garden to be this vehicle, no pun intended, of opportunity for young students, young orphans. It gives them the chance to explore the world, engage in diplomacy, and basically experience life to the fullest, and so forth. So there's a very positive and benevolent sort of agenda from Cid's perspective. However, for Norg's part, he is essentially wanting an army of amoral automatons who will sell their swords to the highest bidder in the pursuit of profit and return on his investment. But really, I think it's it does a number of things at once, if quite subtly. Firstly, I think it shows how toothless and impotent that Sid Kramer's leadership actually is, and what this does is it paves the way for Squall's ascension into leadership. It kind of legitimizes him as a leader, because Sid clearly isn't. It also undermines the duplicitous garden faculty, and actually we see them written out of the game after this, which in a very subtle way paves the way equally for the maturity and the ascension of the students into adulthood. So Squall, of course, Quistis, Zhu and Nida, each of them kind of adulting now that we have this liberated garden at our disposal. Garden is basically representative of a maturing and evolving student body, epitomised through the character arc of Squall. So there we have it, Balamb Garden as a home, a school and a vehicle, an incredibly important, and we could argue perhaps the most important set piece and location in all of Final Fantasy VIII. It reflects the changing momentum and pace of the story. It works uniquely as a home location and hosts many scenarios of the story. And actually thinking about it, thinking about the FMV cutscenes, which are of course very aesthetically pleasing and take a lot of time and effort to make, there is no less than 5 cutscenes at least that feature Balamb Garden throughout the game, from the opening shot of the school to the ballroom scene, the flying scene, the Battle of the Gardens, all the way through to the ending FMV. So I think it shows the significance of this location in the overall story of FF8. And again, perhaps uniquely for a Final Fantasy, it ends where it begins, in this comforting home for our party members. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you'd like to buy me a coffee, that would be lovely. The links are available below.